You're witnessing an event unlike anything before. This isn't a simple trade disagreement, nor is it just tactical posturing. What's unfolding is the first time in modern memory that an American president has lost command of a trade war he himself initiated, while the other nations simply walked away. Canada, that quiet neighbor to the north often overlooked by U.S. politicians, just enacted the scenario Trump promised could never happen. Let's break down the reality. On February 1st, 2025, Donald Trump signed executive orders slapping 25% tariffs on nearly all Canadian imports. Energy products were hit at 10%. He invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a statute intended for national crises, to bypass the trade deal he negotiated during his first term. His stated reason: fentanyl crossing the border. Despite U.S. Customs data showing almost no fentanyl coming from Canada, that didn't matter. The goal was sending a signal. Canada responded immediately with $30 billion in counter-tariffs on American exports: orange juice, peanut butter, wine, appliances, motorcycles. Within 3 weeks, this retaliation surged to $155 billion, covering steel, aluminum, cars, beef, pork, dairy, every economic lever Canada could apply. Then something extraordinary occurred. Mark Carney assumed the role of Prime Minister. Understanding who this man is matters. Former Governor of the Bank of Canada, former Governor of the Bank of England, only individual ever to lead the central banks of the G7 nations, and expert in economic systems and leverage. His first speech as Prime Minister designate made Trump's miscalculation obvious. Carney declared that the retaliatory tariffs would remain until the Americans demonstrated respect. Not until negotiations concluded. Not until a deal was reached. Respect first. That's not standard diplomatic language. That's the tone of someone rejecting the old rules. By August, Trump raised tariffs to 35% on Canadian goods outside the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. The stated justification: retaliation. Fentanyl, trade deficits, a circular logic revealing the real strategy: coercing Canada into compliance. But here's what Trump overlooked: Canada is Mexico. It isn't China. The economic framework is different. 63% of Canadian exports to the U.S. are intermediate inputs: energy, construction materials, agricultural products, rare resources essential to American manufacturing. Tariffs on these inputs don't just hurt Canada, they disrupt U.S. supply chains. The Wall Street Journal called it the dumbest trade war in history. Their editorial board, usually favorable to Republican economic policy, said the justification made no sense. They were right. The S&P 500 hit correction territory on March 10th, dropping 10.1% from its February peak. Over $4 trillion wiped out. April brought new auto tariffs. The S&P 500 fell over 10% in today's worst week since the COVID recession. American investors were pricing in a reality Trump refused to acknowledge. This wasn't bargaining, it was self-inflicted economic harm. You might think Canada relies on the U.S. for more than vice versa, right? 75% of Canadian exports go south. They'll cave first. That's exactly what Trump assumed. That's why he escalated. On January 16, 2026, Carney landed in Beijing, the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit China since 2017. He met Xi Jinping. A preliminary deal was announced. China would cut tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 85% to 15%, unlocking a $4 billion market. Anti-discrimination tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peacefully $3 billion were removed. In exchange, Canada allowed 39,000 Chinese EVs annually at 6.1% tariffs, growing to 70,000 in 5 years. Canada had imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs in October 2024, matching U.S. policy. Carney broke that alignment. Trump retaliated quickly, a Truth Social post threatening 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if the China deal proceeded. His words: if Carney thinks Canada will be a conduit for Chinese goods to enter the U.S., he's mistaken. Notice the phrasing: Governor Carney, not Prime Minister. Trump had publicly referred to Canada as a potential 51st state, posting maps showing Canada as U.S. territory, insisting Canada survives because of the United States. This isn't trade, it's annexation fantasy masked as negotiation. Carney called the bluff. January 20th, Davos, Switzerland, the World Economic Forum. Carney's speech broadcast globally. The 80-year era of U.S. global economic leadership is over. The rules-based international order. Partially false. The strongest have always exempted themselves. Trade rules applied unevenly. International law enforced selectively. He warned, middle powers must unite, because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Canada was forming a coalition not to challenge U.S. interests, but to survive without dependence. European and Asian capitals praised the speech. Trump called it a disaster, claiming Carney walked it back. Carney clarified to the president, "I meant exactly what I said in Davos." Canada was first to recognize the shift in U.S. trade policy. We are pursuing 12 new trade deals across 4 continents. Numbers tell the story. Canadian exports to Europe rose 22% in 2025 compared to 2024. Africa up 18%. Central and South America up 11%, covering roughly 25–30% of lost U.S. export volume. Not all, but enough to prove the strategy works. Canada is also negotiating with India, ASEAN, and Mercosur. The aim? Reduce U.S. leverage, create economic alternatives. Provincial governments took action. Ontario removed all U.S. alcohol from stores. Nova Scotia doubled tolls on American commercial vehicles. British Columbia mandated domestic production of biofuels and gasoline. Ontario canceled a $100 million contract with Musk's Starlink. These were independent provincial measures maximizing economic pressure. American businesses felt it fast. Ohio exports $19.9 billion annually to Canada, more than its next 6 destinations combined. Unemployment in Ohio hit 5%, among the highest nationwide. Michigan auto plants reliant on Canadian steel faced delays. U.S. refineries built for Canadian crude can easily switch. Bank of Canada projections in March, combined U.S. and Canadian tariffs would cut Canadian real GDP by at least 3% over 2025-26, a permanent loss. Business investment down 12%, exports down 9%, unemployment up, consumer spending weak. Devastating numbers, but Canada accepted them, creating a $6.5 billion trade impact program to support businesses, defer taxes, provide up to $40 billion in liquidity, enhance agriculture support, modify unemployment insurance, see retool deployed. Carney's calculation, short-term pain for long-term sovereignty. Economic dependence on an unreliable partner costs more than diversification, even if it hurts. Meanwhile, Trump faced legal setbacks. A federal court struck down his tariff orders in May 2025. The Court of International Trade ruled fentanyl and reciprocal tariffs exceeded presidential authority. Enjoined permanently. Trump appealed. The decision was affirmed in August. Tariffs illegal, but he maintained them. By September, contradictions became clear. Canada lifted most retaliatory tariffs on goods covered by the USMCA, not as concession, but as strategic simplification. Why enforce costly tariffs that mostly harm Canadian consumers when that energy could build alternative trade ties? Steel, aluminum, auto tariffs remained dollar for dollar with U.S., but broader consumer goods lifted. Canada refused to play Trump's game. Some Trump supporters claim it's negotiation theater, that the threats are working. Wrong. Negotiation requires both sides to believe a mutually beneficial deal is possible. Trump repeatedly claimed Canada would be better as the 51st state, the border artificial, and that U.S. generosity underwrites Canadian trade. These aren't negotiation points, they're territorial claims. Carney replied, Canadian annexation will never happen. Trump's words were a threat to sovereignty, not trade. Here's why it matters. Trump wasn't seeking better trade terms. He aimed to make Canada economically dependent, forcing compliance. The China deal broke that strategy. Canada proved it has options. Once options exist, leverage reverses. Trump threatened Greenland militarily if Denmark didn't sell, posted maps claiming Venezuela, Cuba. Greenland is U.S. territory, and told Carney Canada survives because of the U.S., not isolated statements, a pattern of coercion backed by force. Carney's Davos response clarified the global lesson. Middle powers saw that U.S. threats have limits. They began forming alternative trade ties, payment systems outside the U.S. dollar, supply chains bypassing American infrastructure. The USMCA review in 2026 mattered when both parties wanted continuity. Now, Carney expects respect for Canadian sovereignty, but prepares for scenarios where it's ignorant, building contingency plans for full economic separation. Trump treats tariffs as pressure without urgency. Canada doesn't wait the act. American workers must understand. Supply chain shifts are permanent. A Canadian mining company rerouting copper to Europe doesn't reverse it post-Trump. Canadian energy infrastructure built for Asia doesn't dismantle for U.S. reconciliation. Permanent realignments. By July 2025, U.S. tariffs on Canadian vehicles and parts exceeded $380 million in a single month. Tariff-free Canadian auto exports to the U.S. dropped from nearly all to just over one-third. U.S. automakers relying on Canadian parts, Ford, GM, still face enviable operations. Production is relocating to Mexico for USMCAs, to Europe for broader markets. Jobs aren't returning. Trump pledged to rebuild U.S. manufacturing instead. It's relocating to countries avoiding conflict with major trading partners. The consequences are visible now. Early 2025 recession avoided, but 2026 growth forecasts drop. Consumer confidence fell 11% in March. Americans anticipate inflation. Bloomberg calls Trump's tariff strategy baffling and ineffective. A Harris poll, 60% believe tariffs will raise price the right. Tariffs are import taxes. U.S. firms pay costs passed to consumers' grocery bills, gas, phones, cars still pricier. Meanwhile, Canada signs deals with China, Europe, India, building an economy resilient without the U.S. not by choice, by necessity. Key watch point, USMCA review in 2026. If it collapses, tariffs become permanent. U.S. firms lose guaranteed Canadian access. Energy and manufacturing costs spike. Recession looms. Trump's bet, Canada will panic first. Leverage only works if the threatened party values the threat more than walking away. Canada proved sovereignty outweighs access. Trump entered this trade war believing he held all cards. Reality, economic interdependence cuts both ways. Threatens survival. Partners become opponents. Opponents with nothing to lose act differently than cooperative partners. Canada can survive without the U.S. It'll hurt, but they can. The question, can the U.S. endure without Canada's energy, raw materials, and integrated supply chains? Trump wagered everything on Canadian capitulation. They didn't. Escalated risk recession. Back down, not admit failure. Neither is winning. That's the hidden disaster. Loss of control. Trump cannot coerce Canada to building alternatives. Victory is impossible. Economic damage grows. This is the cost of treating allies like enemies, confusing proximity for leverage, and believing sovereignty threats yield compliance. Canada demonstrates how middle powers endure under great power pressure, form coalitions, diversify dependencies, accept short-term pain for long-term autonomy, call bluffs and reveal who holds real leverage. Every nation observing Canada is learning. American dominance isn't guaranteed, it's conditional. When conditions change, the rules do too. Trump thought he started a trade war. He actually should. U.S. threats have limits, middle powers have options, and sovereignty trumps market access when survival is at stake. Global trade maps are rewriting it in Washington, but Ottawa, Beijing, Brussels, New Delhi, new networks form, new partnerships solidify. The U.S. is learning what it's like to be outside. Grocery bills rising, gas prices climbing, job security weakening, not because Canada attacked U.S. workers, but because Trump attacked Canadian sovereignty, and Canada responded by showing they don't need the U.S. as much as he assumed. This is the trade disaster unfolding, a relationship broken by someone mistaking leverage for control, strength for bullying, winning for command. Control loss rarely returns. To understand the real story while media spins fairy tales, subscribe and turn on notifications. This saga is far from over, and what comes next will reshape your perception of American power. Comment which country you think will break from U.S. dependence next. Already happening.